Okay, everybody, welcome back to our second session on decision-making in government. I am joined by an esteemed panel. I have agreed to introduce them with a very brief biography only, simply because we will be here for half an hour. If I try and explain to you exactly why they are such experts in their fields. So to my immediate left is Professor Sir John Aston. John is the Harding Professor of Statistics in Public Life here at Cambridge, and he's the former Chief Scientific Advisor at the Home Office for 4 years. And if you think that's an easy job, it isn't. So John has seen the workings of government close up and delighted to have him on the panel. Next to John is Professor Sarah Dillon. And Sarah is Professor of Literature and the Public Humanities at Cambridge. And last year was co-author of a very interesting book called Story Listening, Narrative Evidence and Public Reasoning. And there are a lot of dimensions to some of the crises we've been going through that connect to the kinds of stories we tell about them. So very much looking forward to your contribution, Sarah. And finally, on the end is Professor Dame Teresa Marteau. Teresa is a behaviour scientist and director of the Behaviour and Health Research Unit here in Cambridge, and someone with great experience in advising governments, including through the SAGE process, and she will no doubt discuss that as we go along. So thank you to my esteemed panel, and looking forward very much to our discussion. So as with the previous session, let's start with a few minutes from each of you on the sort of guiding question, the exam question, if we want to call it that, on how are political decisions best made and communicated in a crisis. And John, if I can start with you.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for being in a room with lots of people. It's a very surreal but lovely experience. I'm going to be drawing, as you might guess, on my experience in the Home Office. There were, a number of things in the question about political decision making, how it is best made and communicated, and then in a crisis. And so the Home Office has had its fair share of crises. During my time, there were a number of things that I think would be very legitimately called crises. I was there during the Russian use of chemical weapons in Salisbury. I was there when drones were flown at Gatwick. And then, of course, I was there during COVID. And those, among others, all had different aspects of decision-making. I think it's important to start with something that's almost a tautology, but that good political decisions are made by political leaders. And I think we need to be really careful to make sure that we are giving our political leaders the best opportunity to make those decisions, and that those decisions aren't seen to be made by experts or others, that experts absolutely need to put into the decision-making process, but ultimately in a democratic system, we need to be able to hold people to account for their decisions, and therefore the decisions must be able to be made by our political leaders. Crises are all different, but they share common features, and usually the sort of obvious thing that happens during a crisis is that crises are made under huge pressure and sort of stress. And that needs to be taken into account in the decision making, but good crisis decision making still follows a process. And I think it's important to understand that that process sometimes has to be very compressed, that sometimes that process has to be done with very little real information, but that process, if you can follow that process still, you'll still have the comfort of that decision making. And I think that's very important in the sense of the last thing you want in a crisis is decisions to be made out of surprise in the process. The best thing that I can say for crisis decision making, and one of the things that I learned hugely, was both from experience and from practice. That being able to practice making decisions under crisis-like environments allows you to have some idea of what it might feel like when the real thing comes along, and you learn from each preceding crisis. I certainly know that the decision making we made in COVID was absolutely informed by the way we'd made decisions and helped decisions be made in previous crises. I think that the last thing I really want to say is that I think that the best decisions can be broken up into various time points and stages. And that comes to the question around communication as well. I think that there's a lot of need for the ability to have safe spaces for decision making to be made, even though those spaces may need to be very short and compressed, so that the real options and opportunities of the decisions can be taken into account early on and thought about in many different ways before that decision is then made and then communicated in a way that shows where that decision is going and what the outcome of that decision is. So I think there are many aspects, but I think we should also think and consider the temporal aspect of how decisions are made, even during a crisis, which is often very short.
John, thank you so much. And we might pick up on this in conversation as we go. So if I move to you now, Sarah, please.
I'm going to start by addressing the question, what on earth I'm doing here? As a scholar of literature. I do have a kind of wonderfully spectral figure sitting on my shoulder, which is my co-author of the book that Dennis has mentioned, who is Claire Craig, who may be known to some of you. She's now a head of house at Oxford, but she was the head of the Government Office for Science, had many years of experience in decision-making and science advice, and was a member of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. So everything that I say today is informed by about 4 or 5 years close collaboration with Claire. Everything I get wrong and that is stupid or daft is entirely my own responsibility. So I absolve Claire of that. And actually that's the place I'll start, is that I haven't worked in any of these environments, but I would think that most humanities scholars would say that they hadn't either. And that was why we wrote the book. We came at it from different directions. Claire had spent many years observing the various types of evidence, informally or formally, that people used to make decisions in government, which included anecdotal evidence from stories or reference to the film or the book that they'd read that weekend, but that wasn't treated rigorously in the same way as evidence from science was. And there was a frustration there on her part. And I came at it from being asked many years ago now by CSAP, which is another organization in Cambridge that works at the policy interface, to attend a panel on how the humanities can best help the work of government, and was kind of dissatisfied by where we got that afternoon. So that's kind of why I'm here and what I know. My specialism is in literature and narrative and the epistemological value of it. So what forms of knowledge we can gain from stories, and then more broadly, what forms of knowledge we can gain from qualitative evidence more broadly, which might be narrative evidence as we call it, but other humanities disciplines might class the kind of evidence they would produce differently. What I'm not here to talk about, and this may surprise and go against the expectation, is about telling stories. I'm not here as an expert on communication, and I'm not here as an expert on how good stories are told. I'm here as an expert on the cognitive value of stories and how they can provide evidence to inform decision making as part of a pluralistic evidence base. And that would be where my answer to this question starts, which is how are political decisions best made? I'm not going to address the communication. How best made in times of crisis would be informed by evidence. And that means both the decisions are informed by evidence that is relevant to the question, but also to address communication, that the communication is informed by evidence about best practice around science communication or political decision-making communication. One of the arguments we make in the book is that narrative evidence has a role to play here because of the value that stories have in offering different points of view, so determining the framing of a question before you even sort of start thinking about policy answers, by offering insight into collective identities in ways that transcend or transect traditional divisions based on perhaps sex, age, class, and such like. One example would be Brexit, which has defied traditional political categorizations, but there are certain narratives or stories that circulate amongst certain communities where you can start to see different types of collective identities as narrative models that allow you to model aspects of the world, but in ways that aren't scientific models, but can complement scientific models. And when you're thinking about anticipations of the future. So that's the case that narrative evidence can play a role in each of those ways. And that it needs to be included in order for good decisions to be made. We've seen with COVID, we've seen with climate change. They're the kind of not the weak signals, but the very strong signals that we need a pluralistic evidence base, and that there's whole rafts of knowledge out there that we're not incorporating. You could just take the IPCC reports, for instance, as an example. I haven't been able to do an analysis of subject breakdown of the most recent ones, but our research assistant did a breakdown of the 1.5 degree, and there were 7% social sciences on those authorship panels and 0% from the humanities. Yet we've got reports that have come out recently which are about adaptability, which are about resilience, which are about human societies and communities. And the humanities have expertise there that needs to be taken into account. And the last thing I would address is to quibble a little bit with the definition of crisis. And here I do put my slightly scholarly literary hat on. If you go back to the Greek etymology of crisis, it simply means a decision. So all decisions are moments of crisis. Now we think now, perhaps with COVID and some of the examples, John, you've given about crisis as imminent, as something that's urgent, that happens, that takes us by surprise. But we regularly talk now about the climate crisis. That is not temporally imminent. We've known about this since the 1970s. In fact, there's a wonderful novel by Herzog from the late 1970s called Heat, which provides a fantastic narrative model about different forms of evidence and how they can inform political decision-making about climate. And that was decades ago. So the climate crisis isn't imminent. Well, it is, it is in one sense, but it's not surprising. Antimicrobial resistance would be another one we might think of as a crisis, but it's not something that is happening, just in an isolated moment of time. So I think we have to think about crises on different temporal scales as well.
Sarah, thank you very much. And warning next time if you're going to use Greek. Teresa, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Sarah for deconstructing the question. I'd expect nothing less from the panel. And actually what I'm hearing from both John and Sarah is surprising overlap in terms of how I'm approaching the exam question. So I'm approaching it from the perspective of an evidence generator, a behavioral scientist, and somebody who I don't know if I've actually contributed to any political decisions, but I've attempted to, both in periods of crisis, most recently during the current pandemic. So Dennis already mentioned I was a participant in SAGE, and in particular in two of the maybe about a dozen subgroups, SPI-B, which is the behavioral science subgroup, and the EMG, environment and modeling group. I also contributed in 2009 to the H1N1 swine flu pandemic through a group related to SPI-B. And outside of crises, I've contributed to discussions with policymakers in a range of areas, including obesity, tobacco, alcohol policies, as well as the levelling up agenda, particularly Mission 7, for those of you who are familiar with your Levelling Up white paper. So that's on healthy life expectancy and increasing it by 5 years, by 2035, and narrowing gaps between places, and also net zero. So that gives you some of my experience. In answer to my first go at the question in terms of how a political decision is best made, in a crisis, I think that they have the same characteristics of decisions outside of a crisis, except they're made at speed, sharing two characteristics. And as I say, this is as an evidence person. First of all, with awareness of the salient evidence and its uncertainties. And secondly, regardless of decision, an evaluation designed in so that we know the consequences of the decision. Now, both of those require some additional support during times of crises. So we saw that with regards to the generation of evidence and its uncertainty, SAGE was stood up, and probably the largest peacetime contribution of science, maybe even in wartime, science and scientists that we've ever seen. Absolutely phenomenal. But it also required to build on existing systems, particularly existing systems for evaluation and monitoring of policies. I'm not going to comment on how well I thought any of this went. We can come on to that later. And then just to say a little bit about how political decisions best communicated. Well, there's a lot of communication between a lot of actors. So John has mentioned safe spaces that might be between some of the players within the political arena, but I'm thinking about communication of political decisions to the public. And 3 characteristics come out again and again in the literature. So it's clarity, competence, and warmth. So that's communication from political leaders. And with those characteristics, that increases the chances that people understand what's being said, they're engaged, their trust in the message is enhanced, and action is more likely. Now, the effectiveness of any communication to the public is enhanced with high levels of pre-existing trust in governments and also trust across a society.
Teresa, thank you so much. What a great set of opening addresses. We were discussing beforehand in the green room that apparently the sign, according to media training specialists, of a good panel is when it just loses control and people depart from their planned answers. So let's see how we go. I think it's quite likely just from what was going on in the green room. So let me start perhaps with something you mentioned, John, which is about political decision making being made by political leaders. To the extent that that's true, and you know, I don't disagree with it necessarily, what then is the role of expertise? You know, all of us talk about expertise. Teresa talked about bringing in expertise from outside into government decision making. What is the role of expertise in that? Is there a point in having experts if in the end we just say, well, over to you politicians, you now work it out from here? If I can put it slightly provocatively. John.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think that in no way am I advocating that there should be evidence in the that the evidence shouldn't play a huge part in that decision-making process. It's simply the point of decision. You know, somebody has to take a decision, and it ultimately should be someone who is accountable in some way to, you know, in our system, to the public. But for me, it's vital that the decision-making process has the best evidence available to it. And I think that the best decisions are made when they consider all angles that could be part of that decision-making, both the positives and the negatives. And that can only come if they have the expert information to do that. Now, I think there's differences between expertise and evidence. I think we need to say that, you know, there are many sources of evidence, and experts are often seen as people from outside, not completely, but often seen that way. There's a lot of evidence that's generated inside government that, you know, gets used in making the decision-making process. And I think often, if we only see what's happening, evidence that's coming from the outside, we miss that underlying bit that's also being generated inside. And it's the bringing together of all of that that actually helps make good decisions. But I do think it's really important that when decisions are made, that there is expertise available, particularly before the decision is made, in order to really help explain what the options are and what the implications of those options are. And for me, in my role when I was a CSA, the most important thing was to make sure that that evidence was being presented, because then the decision has to be made in light of that evidence. That decision can go many ways, and expertise and evidence is not the only thing that is taken into account during a political decision, and I think that's fine. That's not something I think is wrong. It's not a technocracy where you say this is the evidence, you do that, but you lose a huge amount, and, you know, I think ultimately worse decisions are made if the evidence is not being seen before that decision is made.
Can I jump in? I think I hadn't thought about it, but the question of who counts as an expert links quite nicely to the first panel, actually. Brian Wynne did some really interesting work on Cumbrian sheep farmers in relation to Sellafield. And the Cumbrian sheep farmers weren't considered experts. So their evidence, their knowledge was not taken into account when decisions were made. And one could argue that poorer decisions were made as a result. So there's place-based expertise, I guess, in some ways, which would link the panels. The broader question that I was interested in, what would a humanities expert look like? Like, is it beyond conceivable that we might have chief humanities advisors that play a role of synthesis and pluralistic evidence gathering? We don't have those. But the model that we found useful was, and many of you may be familiar with it, which is Roger Pilkey's book, The Honest Broker, which is quite an old book now. But he gives a kind of taxonomy of the ways in which experts or scientists, as far as he's concerned, can relate to government, depending on their view of what science is and their view of what democracy is. And there's the pure scientist, there's the issue advocate who's very much committed to a certain policy outcome and whose evidence is intended to try and make that happen. There's the science arbiter who's responsive to questions from government. And then there's the honest broker, which I think is possibly the closest to the CSA in the sense of their responsibility is to provide, to make decision makers aware of the many options and the evidence around them, but not to make decisions. And Ian Boyd, who was CSA at DEFRA, I think, has spoken really interestingly about this. And he said that the role of the expert is to be the voice of reason, not dissent in the public sphere. And I think sort of enabling a division between one's political opinions and whether they align or not with the administration of the day and the responsibility to presenting evidence is a really important one. And that chimes with your distinction between who then makes the decisions. Yeah.
Therese, would you want to come in on that, or?
Yes, so I'm just thinking about the very different perspectives that we're taking. So thinking about John as the CSA, so he is there to have a dialogue with the decision maker. And I'm thinking about myself in a beautifully coloured organogram that the Institute for Government produced for decision making during the pandemic. And Sage is in a pink box on the left-hand side with the two messengers who are Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, and then all around any number of different committees, and underneath, not shown, are all the other SPADs and various special advisors and various others sort of trying to get in. And one of the frustrating things that I found, particularly in relation to one or two political decisions, which I felt definitely went against the evidence that we continue to give them, was that the policy was made and there was no communication back, so that the people who had written the carefully constructed papers, but clearly maybe not carefully constructed now, could say, oh, I can see in relation to this policy, what you've done is you've suddenly introduced a punishment if people do that. We said in the paper, actually, that would not encourage this behavior, but you've done that. So can we just have a conversation about that and why we put in that sentence? So the frustration is that sometimes the evidence is lobbed over, and unless there's somebody like John who is curating it, it can get lost, or at least to have an opportunity to say, are you really sure you want to do that? Because the evidence would suggest that's going to undermine all the other things you're doing.
I think that's a great point.
So having a more of a conversation. I mean, obviously you can't have a continued conversation, but not for it to be such a one-way street.
I think it's a great point, because it emphasizes that public policy, as I said at the outset, is a conversation, it's a discussion, it's a debate. And as an observer, you think there is or let me pose it as a question, is there a tendency for silos to emerge, in the sense that Sage is one silo out of which here is some information, do with that as you will. And then there are people actually in the room, wherever in the room is in 2022, who are making the decisions. But because you're not in the room with them, arguing back and forth and saying, no, you've misunderstood this aspect and that aspect. Is there a tendency towards that in the way we're currently structured in our decision making? Is that something you've observed? Perhaps John, and then move along.
So, I mean, I think there is I can only go back to my role. I always saw my role very much as a translation role, in the sense that I was trying to take evidence that was coming from many sources, and I'm absolutely agree with Sarah in that I always said that science meant academia. The Home Office is a social policy department. Social science was probably the most important areas of science that were needed in the Home Office, far beyond, there was a role for physics and chemistry, but it wasn't the same role that you needed for social science. And so trying to work out how to take that and then allow, in exactly the way Teresa said, that conversation to happen between two sets of people who often don't actually speak the same language. And I think that's part of the issue, in that very, very carefully crafted sentences in some evidence get sometimes misunderstood. And I need to take it on board when that translation has not worked, because it's about making sure that translation happens. But then similarly, political leaders, policymakers, senior officials in government have questions that they want to ask. They frame those questions and then they're taken by academia in a completely different direction, because either that's the easier way to answer them, or there's a slight misunderstanding of what the actual real underlying question is. And sometimes it's actually quite difficult to ask the real question, because that acknowledgement of lack of knowledge can be quite difficult sometimes. So trying to then work out how to frame questions that are being asked on the decision maker side, so that they are actually viable questions that can be answered by experts, academia, etc., is actually one of the biggest things that needs to be done to have that, to allow that conversation to happen.
That was something that did happen more and more in discussions between the policymakers and the Government Office for Science, in terms of, well, this is what we want to know. And actually the scientists would then help the policymaker to shape what they wanted to know into something that was potentially knowable. And that's when it works really, really well. Yeah.
There's CAPE, which is another thing I've discovered in Cambridge, which I didn't know anything about, which I've now forgotten what it stands for, something and policy engagement. And there I encountered the term co-production, which wasn't something I was familiar with, but that co-production happening. And again, we're working in an ideal space here where you don't have to make a decision in the next hour, but that co-production happening in terms of the very questions and framing that is asked, not just in terms of answering them. And the other thing that question calls to mind is the idea of long-term relationships, so that there are established connections where you've learned a little bit how to speak each other's language. The number of times Claire and I used words that meant something totally different to each other, which is why actually we ended up creating a glossary for the book, because we realized that when you're writing for multiple audiences and multiple disciplines, one word might mean, the same word might mean something totally different to somebody else, or not mean anything at all. So those long-term relationships where you can build up those translation exercises, so that if you do then have an imminent crisis, you've at least got a baseline to be functioning off.
Perhaps if I ask you this first, Teresa, is there ever a time when there's actually too much information? Is there such a thing as too much information in a crisis situation? You talked about the need for warmth and clarity in government messaging. A natural role of an expert is to pour information in to make sure you get all the complexities of this. Do we need to sort of reel that back a little bit for translation to the public?
So I say for the public, absolutely. But before I get to the public, can I just think about the evidence generators for the policymakers? And there will be people in this room who could speak to what they find useful and what they don't find useful. So I think certainly as SAGE progressed, over 2 years, I think the quality of the documents produced went up and up and up. And really what you want is, a one-page document that summarizes the evidence with a statement about how confident one is, say some communication about the uncertainty with the recommendation, and then the rest of the paper sits behind that. So high-level summaries about what the evidence tells you, where the uncertainties lie. And in terms of communicating to the public, a paper that some of us wrote, I don't know if it's called this 5 Rules for Evidence Communication. So this with David Spiegelhalter, Michael Blasland, and a few others at the Winton Centre. And in it, we cite John Krebs, who, when he was chair of the Food Standards Agency, he would say, in terms of communicating uncertainty, say what you know, say what you don't know, say what you're going to do to find out about what you don't know, say what the best thing is to do now to be on the safe side, and say that you will update the advice accordingly. Pretty good, I think.
No, it is pretty good.
Can I quickly?
Please,
I think
jump in.
the saying what you don't know is something that's often neglected, but incredibly important. And I think that the one thing I would add to your list is say how long you think you might take to know that. Because if you're in a crisis and somebody says, well, in actual fact, we've got to make this decision now, and you can say, yeah, but in an hour's time, I'll know this. That's far different from saying, I don't know that. And if you say, well, in actual fact, in order to know that, I'm going to need a week. And they say, well, the decision's going to be made in the next 90 minutes, then it doesn't matter. You're not going to know it. You should just treat it as unknown. So being really clear about what you do and don't know, how long you might take to find that out. And, I think the other list you had, I think they are really, really vital, but often people just focus on what they know, and often not in a particularly synthesized way. And I think that can often make things very difficult.
Does that cause potentially a political problem then for our political decision makers? Because it seems to me that politics thrives on certainty. We want clear messages to the sense, do I wear a face mask, yes or no? Will it protect me, yes or no? Well, the scientists might say, it might improve your chances by 70%, and I'll be able to clarify that number for you a little bit, later down the track. How do we resolve that tension? Because a politician is almost certainly going to reach for the binary from the complexity of information that is given to them in different forms. Perhaps, Sarah, is this where narrative, understanding of qualitative information can help you get around the starkness of numbers?
Well, this is where I'd say I'm at the limits of my competence, and actually I think it's a really important thing to acknowledge is where we have competence and where we don't. I'm not the right person to ask about how politicians make decisions. That would need to be somebody who has been one or studies political decision making, which is not what I am interested in. The evidence and ensuring that there's a range of evidence that can inform it. I don't know anything about what you actually do if you're the elected politician. So I think that's also, I think as academics and as experts, it's really important that we just go, I don't know that, not because I haven't found it out, but actually because I'm never going to know that, because that's not what I do, which is probably not the answer that you wanted, but it does come back to John's point that that's the politician's role, and they're the democratically, hopefully, elected decision maker in the ideal democratic state. And there must be, I'm sure there'll be people in the room, the whole body of research done on how you make decisions in the face of complexity. But I think that's not the same as how you ensure a range of evidence that could or may not inform those decisions.
It's great. Please pick up.
Communicating uncertainty, as John has also said, that that uncertainty is actually you didn't say this, I'm going to say it, but I think it was implicit in what you said, that uncertainty is implicit in science. So it changes, you know, that's why we do it. And my own values, it would be a better world if politicians said, we're introducing this policy, it's based on the best available evidence, but what we're going to do is evaluate it, monitor it, and see if it is value for money, if it is taking us down this road to achieve this goal, and make changes if it doesn't, and pull the plug if it's clear that it's not an effective thing to do. So to shift that narrative, but there are clearly reasons why that doesn't prove popular. But I think it's incredibly important in terms of communicating of evidence, because without communicating the uncertainty, one is misrepresenting science. So people can say, well, you told us that face masks didn't work, and now you're saying that they do. So it undermines, it's a misrepresentation of science and undermines the scientific communication that comes, that people have to be in a state of uncertainty. But we as humans don't like uncertainty. You know, we can remember what the figures are. You know, we know that there's a statistical probability of this, that, or the other. But in the end, we function on gist. It will or it won't hurt me. It will or it won't be a good thing to do. So cognitively, it's quite a challenge.
That's also historically been one of the criticisms of the communication of climate science, which was that it did rest its credentials on certainty. In 99 or whatever percentage it was that year of scientists agree that there's anthropogenic climate change. And of course that less than 100% was exactly what gave people who wanted to argue against it the window to say, but there's uncertainty here. And I think there's a lesson being learned there that actually, well, you know, by insisting on certainty when there wasn't 100% certainty, we left a gap for a rational or reasoned case against it, that if you're not 100%, then there's still the possibility that you're wrong. So that I think there's a historical case study there that we've learned from. Yeah.
And I think uncertainty has different perceptions pre and post decision. I think pre-decision, uncertainty can actually be quite politically useful, because you can understand what arguments will be made against you later on. You can see that, well, this will be called out because that it's not certain, and there's other evidence against that. And that can be very useful in a decision-making process to understand what are the arguments before and backwards. Post-decision, the decision's been made. And that point is when the uncertainty from many people's point of view becomes awkward, because the decision is usually a binary decision. And that's the difficulty, that often in many cases, decision making is about persuading people to do things. And at that point, it becomes more difficult to understand how to communicate. But I still think that in the evidence itself, being honest and clear about what that uncertainty is in the long run is always going to be beneficial.
Can I ask you raise a question, which is about the question of, and it links to that, John, about how you evaluate, you know, after the fact. And of course, you can build evaluation structures in, but is there a place for kind of counterfactual thinking or experiments, which is, we're going to implement this one, but in some way we're going to do some kind of counterfactual exercise that like might model or project what would have happened if we'd done the other one? Does that happen?
Yeah, people do that.
Yeah.
I mean, they model. Sometimes they run experiments, randomized control trials. So there are different ways that people can evaluate. Yeah.
And do they get fed back in?
Well, they do. And we're just thinking most recently about the last 2 years, where they did most to best effect is in the evaluation of drugs, including vaccines. So absolutely brilliantly done. Where it wasn't brilliantly done was for any other intervention. So we've already heard mention of test and trace. That was, you know, centrally organized, and I've already mentioned about policies that for I don't think I've gone into detail of self-isolation and in particular, one of the reasons why people often couldn't self-isolate when they were testing positive was because they lacked financial resource to be able to stay at home. And there were various policies that were introduced, and they were never evaluated to see whether or not they did shift what at the beginning of the pandemic were very low estimates of people self-isolating, around 20%, but particularly amongst those who were young and those who were poorest. So we never learned if the policies that were introduced, such as offering people £500, but also a threat of a fine of £1,000 going up to £10,000, actually did increase the proportion of people who were able to self-isolate. So it's an incredibly important thing. So just to build in those evaluations. Actually, I've got an evaluation for you, Sarah. So coming back to...
You've lost it at this point.
So coming back to communication and communication of uncertainty, and something you haven't mentioned is the very gendered nature of communication and leadership that was seen during the pandemic that exists elsewhere. And what was seen in analyses conducted across 194 nations, comparing the countries where there were 19 leaders who were women, comparing the states in the US where the governors were women, looking at the mayors in Brazil where they were women, the infection rates were lower, the death rates were lower. And it's complicated about what might be going on. But one of the things that happened was that women acted more decisively. They were more risk averse to loss of lives. The men were more risk averse to the economy. But also the communication was different. So in the study of the American, the governors, they looked at briefings that were conducted by, I think, 250 briefings. I don't think they looked at the communication of uncertainty, but what they did find was that was where the women were generally more competent and warmer than the men. But critically, there's an interaction between what you're asking people to do, what your policies are, and how you communicate. So when the male governors, like some of the men and some of the women, ordered stay home policies, those were more effective when they were communicated by the women governors. So they're not experimental designs. So there's an awful lot of confounding that's going on there, but it'd be really interesting to have some analysis of those narratives, what it was in those communications that are coming from leaders. So this is the women versus the men, how they were communicating uncertainty, whether they were telling different stories. I mean, in Norway, the female prime minister, she had special briefings for children. So I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from a huge amount of communication over the last 2 years from the leaders speaking directly to the people.
Yeah, it raises the question of whether that is because women are in some way essentially better communicators, in inverted commas, or about the gendered prejudices of the reception of communication. And it sounds like a non-sequitur, but it isn't. So work that's been done on the gendering of automated voice systems like AI and Siri, Alexa and Siri and such, which are all gendered as female. The defense of those companies is that they did their market research and that when they were gendered as female, they were better received. But that's not necessarily a good thing. That might just reflect more about the prejudices of the people who are hearing male or female voices in different environments. Ones that were being helpful and supportive worked better if they were gendered as female. Ones that were authoritative, so for instance on an aircraft, had to be male. So that could play into that. The other thing, and it does come back to the question I sort of refused to answer about how narratives might play into decisions that are made. We do talk in the book about charismatic narratives and charismatic numbers, actually. So it's very, and this links to the lockdown question and debate. It's very easy as a politician to make decisions, I say, knowing there's people here who know much more about this than me, but motivated by the charismatic story or the charismatic numbers. So the imminent, very present death rates, for instance. Much more difficult to make decisions based on less dominant or visible or charismatic narratives. For instance, the systemic and distributed and more long-term effects of lockdown, for instance, on children and their mental health. So that is something where we would argue that politicians need what we call narrative literacy, which is an ability to reflect on and be critical about the influence that stories are having on their decision making, whether that be, are they reasoning appropriately from a single case to a general case? So that would be, is the story, and this is where, again, it's a literary term, but metonymically legitimate, and metonym is where a part stands for a whole. Some stories are metonymically legitimate, and it's very productive to reason from them, but you need to figure out whether that's the case, or is it illegitimate? Are you taking an anecdote and actually it doesn't represent the whole? Are you aware of your own narrative lock-in? Are you aware of where there are narrative deficits, the stories that you don't know about, or stories that haven't even been told yet for some reason? So all of that would play into arguing for greater narrative literacy, which is the sort of individual version of story listening. Story listening would be systemic abilities and structures to take narrative evidence seriously. Narrative literacy is at an individual level from young children, knowing how to process the things that pop up on, I was going to say Facebook, that's so outdated now, isn't it? Their TikTok feed, to senior decision makers who might have done humanities degrees and think therefore that they know, but we wouldn't get, as an individual we might put an umbrella up, but we wouldn't try and do meteorological modeling. Just because you can read a story doesn't mean that you have expertise in how stories work. So that would be another place they might come in.
Thank you. I think I'd better reclaim the chair. Just long enough to say that it's time to ask some people in the room for some contributions and some questions. Mike is quite right. The light is very bright. Seem to be a lot of hands on this side. I'm not. Obviously, I'm more interested. Nobody here. Oh, no, I can see you, Rory. I will come back to you. So let me start right at the back, and then I'll work forward. So, gentleman right at the back.
Thank you, Hugh Lloyd. I've worked with a lot of politicians in my time, and one of the things that strikes me about the decision-making process that they're making is that they're not actually that different to their personal decision-making processes. The political is only because of the job they happen to have at that moment. But in that process of decision-making, they're taking evidence that we might provide to them. They're bringing their own expertise, and we should acknowledge that they have that. Because there wouldn't be those politicians if they didn't. But they've also got a worldview or a mind map and a set of installed software, you might call it, that helps them process those things. How would you go about understanding what that mental model might be, and what difference would it make to how you present evidence to them?
Good heavens, that's frightening. So let's think about we'll think about that and gather a second question as we go. Sitting just in front of the person who asked the last question. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Liz Killen. I work with the Institute for Manufacturing here at the University of Cambridge, but previously within government. I think there's been a fantastic role on the brilliant structures like SAGE and the CSAs in terms of bringing science evidence into government, but I know there's also people in this audience that have that scientific training, and they're working within government, they're generating evidence within government as well. And I think the role of those people within government is really interesting. I know there's a call for a lot more of them within the civil service with that sort of scientific training, but the Institute for Government has put out a report last year suggesting that maybe the civil service does actually have all of these skills, but isn't necessarily aware of where they are. So mobilizing those in a time of crisis can become more difficult. And I would just like to know your thoughts on the internal capabilities of government in terms of that scientific training and evidence generation.
Thank you. Great question. And one more here, right down here at the front in excellent blue waistcoat.
Thank you, Michael Soper. What the short question is, why is the outlier so important in decision making? It is really why, when making decisions, that we reference, or so many, particularly when you say in government, we reference the outlier as being a particularly powerful reason to frame a policy. My own personal example I would cite is, just to bring it down personal, I have a friend who worked in the fishing industry in Lowestoft, working in trawlers for 30 years, and his body's basically broken. Yet when he engages with the benefit system, that benefit system is designed to prevent the outlier, prevent the 1 or 2 people cheating the system. So we built a system that is meant to help people, but we built it around the outlier, around the 1 or 2 cheats. So the story of the cheat, for example, is so powerful that we'll design a system around that. There are many other examples where we suddenly pick on an outlier and go, oh, I want the system to, or the policy to take account of this outlying thing rather than the majority, rather than the main thrust of the policy. The outlier becomes really important. Why is that?
Thank you very much. Well, let's have a go, panel, at these 3, and then we'll move to the other side of the room and some questions online. So let's take them in the order they were given. The mind maps of politicians. There are some places you don't want to go, but and there's sort of the mixture of the personal and the political in decision making. Perhaps Teresa, you're good with the mind. I'll start with you.
Great question, and I recently had that experience. I very rarely meet with or interact with politicians or secretaries of state. They're always kept way away from me. And it so happened, and it wasn't health, the Department of Health and Social Care, it was another government department. And the Secretary of State was in a bit of trouble. And 3 of us were invited in for a conversation a couple of months ago, because a white paper was in a bit of trouble. And his opening salvo was his mental map of human behavior, and it was so wrong. And so my immediate temptation was to say, no. Anyway, I got feedback from the 2 others who were there to say that actually it was a really helpful intervention that I made. I think it's made absolutely no difference. That's the first thing. But secondly, as a behavioral scientist, I felt I had to say that's so interesting that you've putting personal responsibility at the heart of this. That is such a common misrepresentation of human behavior, that we underestimate how much our environments shape our behavior, and we overestimate how much it's within our control. So I made that sort of relatively simple intervention. As I say, I don't think it had any impact. Actually, the white paper isn't out yet, but I doubt that it will. So it's quite rare that one sees that. I'm sure you wouldn't mind me. Yeah, no, well, actually, I won't mention the name. But anyway, a senior person working in government said to me that he spent a lot of time with his Secretary of State trying to work out how he thought. He was a CSA, that's right. And that was, he saw that as his key role, because it was through understanding that mental map of the problems that were on his desk that the CSA could refine the evidence to be of most help, both to the population and also to the Secretary of State. So I think it's a great question.
And so perhaps what I'll do is I'll direct each question to one of you, and if you want, anyone else wants to jump in, then please do. So we just keep rolling and keep moving. So John, perhaps if I put the second question to you about the capacity within government for science and scientific knowledge. Is government ready to go whenever there's a crisis?
So, I mean, firstly, I should say that there are some amazing scientists, analysts in government. I mean, some of the best that I've worked with are in government, and I think we should never forget that a lot of expertise is housed within government. Could there be more? Yes, I think that's I'm probably not surprised that I would say that. But I think there's also, there's probably a little bit of structural change needed about the value that is placed on civil servants particular as they go through the system. I think the value of expertise is absolutely well considered at certain points, but as career structures go through, the value of being a generalist is also highly prized. And I think the ability for scientists and analysts to move through the system in a way that is really recognizes the value that their expertise brings is something that I think will need to be thought about, and how best to do that. I don't think there is an easy answer to this. I think it's not as simple as saying, oh, we'll just allow experts to go up the string. I think that's not what we're saying, but I think there is something about working out how to best value expertise. The things that I thought was always sort of really showed that to me was that I discovered so many people who had scientific backgrounds that I would never have known unless they sort of sidled up and go, you know, by the way, I'm a biologist, or, you know, by the way, I did physics. And it was almost, don't tell anyone else. And it was, and I think we need to be in a position where somebody's prepared to say, I'm a proud physicist and I've gone through the system. And I think if you look at the top level, the really top level of government, there are really good examples of scientists, mathematicians who've got all the way through. But at that sort of middle there, people slightly hide the fact. And I think if we can get to this position where, along with everybody who's done PPE, economics, they're prepared to say, I'm a proud physicist, I'm a proud biologist, I'm a proud social scientist, then I think that would, you know, would show that we'd got to the stage where we're in a good position.
Do you think that the areas of research interest that each department's meant to have, are they working to identify the people with expertise in the department to connect with academia?
I think that they certainly help connect the department to academia. I'm not always sure that it's the direct connections come that way, because I think sometimes they ask about the questions that they don't know the answers to, as opposed to the ones that they've got real expertise in. And I think encouraging government to be more, you know, more open about the fact that you know, you can publish things, and that, you know, some of their that there should be an ease of move between people coming into academia and going out of academia back into government, and that, you know, publishing things within government is actually a very vital source of good academic research. Making that more prominent, it would actually, I think, be very helpful to connect those ones who are doing that research. They just don't necessarily publish it in the same way.
I would see a bigger problem, not so much in terms of individual expertise, but in what I would call sort of literacy in scientific method. I think it's far too low in the civil service, in my limited experience. So certainly room for developing that. And probably it's not higher because there isn't a culture that values it enough. So the National Audit Office report, they published many, they're great reports in December 2021, which looked at evaluation of government spending. And only 8% of major projects were evaluated in 2019. So that spend of, I think, up to, in total, to £450 billion. So a part of the analysis is that there isn't a culture, as well as some capability and capacity, for valuing the generation of evidence. And I was, we had a lot of consultants who were brought in during the pandemic, but some of the civil servants, they might have topic expertise, but in terms of how would you evaluate a policy, how would you evaluate this? I think this is room for the Government Office of Science, now that it's stood down from the pandemic, to really, and people are really keen to learn just the sort of basics of evaluation.
So I think the message is for anyone out there in the civil service, when you go back to work next week, just ask the person next to you, are you secretly a scientist? And it's a good conversation, a good icebreaker. And Sarah, can I come to you for the third of those questions, which is around this sort of embeddedness of particular stories, I guess, about outliers and who they are and what they're like, and whether, you know, how that
Well, that would be my response to that question, which is, whilst having deep sympathy with the individual, I have no idea if that story is metonymically legitimate or not. I don't know if systems are designed primarily around that outlier. So I can't answer the question because I don't know whether the premise is correct. And if so, if it is, then I would say it would come back to this idea of the persuasive power of a charismatic narrative, for instance, that people on benefits are on benefits in order to, somehow cheat the system, rather than because, we have a society in which people end up in that situation and need support. And the question then would be about changing that narrative and that perception of those kinds of people. And that would be about how you research and gather evidence on the collective identities that are primarily affected, or primary stakeholders in the policy decision that you're making. And that would mean getting out to the people that are actually being affected by it, rather than being influenced purely by a narrative about what you think they're like. I did have a quick thought about the first one, which is not from the sort of psychology or behavioral science perspective, but I'm going to bring the Greeks in again. Diane, I think you have or did have a project on wisdom at the Bennett, and this is where my interest in the history of knowledge and the history of the way in which different forms of knowledge are privileged or valued comes in. And here I guess I would say I'm speaking as an individual in answer to this question, which is it's the responsibility of the electorate to put people in those positions of power who we think are wise. And I think wise, a bit like talking about feeling or love this morning. You sort of say wisdom and everyone thinks, you can't measure that. Can't measure that with numbers. But we've failed as a society if we exclude from our forms of knowledge and what we value things that can't be measured in quantitative ways. And so that would be a kind of, and the reason I go back to the Greeks is it's Aristotle who had these different models of reason, and that all of them might be valued in different contexts, in different ways, and wisdom is one of them. So that would be a personal answer rather than an expert answer.
Could I talk about cheating?
If you know something about it, Teresa, of course.
So I'm not cheating on the question. I think it's a really good point. And when I was frustrated about the sentence that was glossed over when government decided to introduce fines and not very much money for people to self-isolate. And so I went on my own quest, and I knew somebody who's a senior economics advisor to Treasury. And it was, so I asked him, say, why? After all these fantastic papers from SAGE saying it's, the poorest households, they need not to lose any money each week and get the money immediately. Didn't you implement that? And it was almost like a moral panic. So it was an overestimate of the proportion of people who would cheat. I was then able to give him a review which showed how populations overestimate cheating, and it's not as high as people think, and give him other evidence that when you've got objective measures, people don't cheat as much as people think they do. So this advisor was very grateful, and into the Chancellor's office went this evidence, but it was a year after, and I would have given it had we been able to have that conversation. So I think you've absolutely got your finger on one of the things that happens, that a narrative grows, which actually can be a narrative that can be subject to a question that has a knowable answer.
Look, I've got a couple of excellent online questions here, which I'll come to. And this right-hand side, you are movers and shakers over here, aren't you?
This guy's literally sort of jumping out of his seat. Trying to get you to answer.
So I will take the question from the jumping at the back there. And then I'll read these two out, and we'll answer the three as a three if we can. Please.
Yeah, it better be a good one if I'm jumping. Eh? Yeah, I think one of the things I've liked is the fact that most of you have sort of alluded to the fact of what's needed in terms of best practice. For example, if it's clarity and competence and warmth in decision making, or just being cognizant of the narrative literacy. But I'm just wondering, either based on your evidence or frustrations, then what should we stop doing?
We're not used to short questions up here. What should we, what should we stop doing?
Who's the we? Who's the we in that question? Okay.
Well, this is an excellent question, which is why I'm going to put it last of our three, so we can answer that well. So I've got a couple of questions here online to add to it. One is around the place or the influence of values in decision making. So, which ties a little bit with your wisdom comments, I guess, Sarah. So, at what point do values enter into decision making, and is it explicit or just implicit? And second question, how can the use of expert policy advice be made more transparent regarding both the selection of experts and the contribution that they make? Let's start with the values. Who would like to kick me off on values?
I can jump in on that. There's a good European, I don't know who I'm talking to, it was someone online. Hello. There was a good European Commission report, 2018, 2019, Understanding Our Political Nature, which has a whole section on values and the way in which they influence decision making. I'm glitching a bit, also has a really interesting section on narrative and metaphor, actually. So it's one of the documents that I found that was coming out of important institutions that were starting to take that into account. I don't think they offer a solution, but at least to begin to start to recognize that influences decision making. And then at least once you're conscious of something, you can try to start to mitigate it in some way. It's also, of course, a strong case for diversity, and I don't use that word lightly. All forms of diversity, viewpoint diversity and personal identity diversity, to try and make sure that you've got a range of values that you can triangulate or more than triangulate between.
Thank you. And on transparency around expertise, Teresa or John?
You want to go first?
Perhaps if I point at one of you and
okay,
Teresa.
I'll go first. There you go. And then Teresa can say. So I think the SAGE process was really interesting. I think the fact that the papers became transparent after time was a really good thing. And I think that the decisions that were made in order for that to happen really did allow a much more nuanced understanding of where those decisions had come from, and whether they were in line with evidence or not. I would make a case, though, from having worked on the other side, that I was much more helpful that those papers came out after the decision than during the decision. I think it would have been really, really hard to have a sort of reasoned, I use the term again, discussion in a safe space around those papers if there had been huge numbers of narratives coming from all over the place about why those papers were right, whether they were wrong, whether the evidence had been taken into account correctly, etc. So I think transparency is absolutely really important in order to be able to evaluate what has been done. I think that complete transparency of the whole process can actually be counterproductive.
Fascinating. Would you agree, Teresa, just quickly?
I don't know where you stop and where you start. So I agree with Sage, but occasionally some of us got hold of the fact that people were briefing government to go down a track that was really going to be, that wasn't in accord with the evidence. So because it was based on the wrong assumptions. And that was never put in the public domain. Some of us got hold of some of the documents, we redid the calculations, gave them to Patrick, who then was able to anticipate what he thought was going to be coming out, what were going to be the priors, how government was thinking about it. So I don't know where you stop. You're saying that some things have to not be confidential, but in the science area, we know that SAGE became open, but there are other scientists who were generating other papers, and those weren't open, and that I think was problematic for those of us who were working in an open system.
Fascinating discussion. We could continue that, which leaves us to finish the question, which was the excellent question on what do we stop doing. I heard the word stop a few times in your answer there, Teresa, but are there particular aspects of the decision-making process and communications in a crisis that we could do away with? Is there a learning from what we've just been through that we don't need? I think that's a winning question.
I think not at a meta level, so it's a great question, just at a very sort of low level answer would be, we didn't evaluate enough to know what we should stop doing. So evaluate more, and by that I mean evaluate in real time. So you've got real feedback, and then we could have stopped doing some things that were incredibly expensive, or adjusted some things so that they would have worked better.
I'm going to take the capaciousness of the we and put a different subject body in there, which is the we, the humanities, which of course is where I'm coming from. And I think this sort of counts as a closing sort of, pitch from that perspective, which is we, the humanities, should stop having a chip on our shoulder about the value of the knowledge that we produce. And we should stop defining ourselves only as of value if we're in positions of opposition and critique, and recognize that we can start being confident in the knowledge we produce, being confident in how we communicate the rigor of the knowledge we produce, and being confident that there's room within the self-definition of the humanities for collaboration and engagement, as well as opposition and critique. And sometimes those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Well, one further thing we should stop is this panel. Not because it's become entirely unruly, but because unfortunately we are running into lunch. I hope it's been a stimulating discussion. I've certainly found it very interesting. Can you please join me in offering some thanks to our